The morphine hadn't fully worn off when Private First Class Robert Morrison first understood he wasn't going to die. He lay on a clean white cot, impossibly clean, sterile white like nothing he'd seen in 6 months of combat, in what had been a German military hospital 48 hours earlier. His left leg, shattered by shrapnel from a Panzerfaust during the final chaotic days before the Reich's collapse, throbbed beneath fresh bandages. But it was there, still attached, still his. The German surgeon who'd operated on him the previous night stood at the foot of the bed, reading a chart. No waiting line, no triage tent where men screamed and bled out on canvas while medics decided who might survive, long enough to warrant attention. Morrison had been carried into the operating theater within 30 minutes of arriving at the field hospital, ahead of 36 American wounded because, and this seemed impossible, he was the most critical case, and this German doctor, this former Wehrmacht officer who'd sutured soldiers of the Reich for 4 years, had simply done his job. "You are very lucky," the surgeon said in careful, accented English. His voice carried no irony, though his own uniform hung loose on a frame that had clearly known better-fed days. "Another hour, you lose the leg. Maybe you die." Morrison wanted to say something, thank you perhaps, or why, or how can you stand there saving the life of someone who was killing your countrymen last week? But his throat closed around the words. Instead, he stared at the doctor's hands. Steady hands, surgeon's hands, hands that had held him together when he should have bled out in the back of a supply truck on the road from Würzburg. Through the window, weak winter sunlight illuminated the skeletal remains of Frankfurt's city center. From his bed, Morrison could see the twisted iron skeleton of a department store, its walls blown away to reveal floors stacked like a child's abandoned toy. In the foreground, closer, almost absurdly normal, a line of German children, perhaps 40 or 50 of them, standing in the hospital courtyard in clothes that barely qualified as rags, waiting. He'd been told they came every day, waiting for scraps from the American mess hall, waiting for anything. One girl stood apart from the others, couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, wearing a coat that had probably fit her 2 winters ago. Her legs were stick-thin beneath a dirty dress. She wasn't crying. None of them were crying. That's what struck Morrison most forcefully. The silence. Children should make noise. Shouts, laughter, squabbles over nothing. These children stood silent as monuments, their faces carrying an ancient exhaustion that no child's face should ever hold. "Your men," the surgeon said, following Morrison's gaze. "They are bringing food today. For Christmas. I think this is good." Morrison tried to process this. Christmas. He'd forgotten it was Christmas Eve. In the chaos of occupation duty, in the pain-blurred days since his injury, time had become elastic, meaningless. Christmas was a memory from another life. His mother's kitchen in Pennsylvania, his sister's off-key caroling, the smell of pine and cinnamon. Christmas was not supposed to be a ruined German city where children waited silently for scraps and enemy surgeons saved your life without hesitation. But it was Christmas Eve, 1945, and something unprecedented was about to happen. 6 months earlier, in that last violent spring before the Reich's collapse, Morrison had been certain of several things. Germans were the enemy, not in an abstract sense, but in the immediate, visceral way that comes from watching your friends die. He'd seen Corporal Jackson's body after Remagen, had helped carry what was left of Sergeant Chen back to the aid station after the Ruhr pocket. The enemy had faces. Wehrmacht soldiers who fought with desperate skill, SS units that sometimes shot prisoners, civilians who occasionally sniped from windows as American columns passed. The propaganda had been unnecessary by then. You didn't need posters to hate people who were trying to kill you. But Morrison, like most American soldiers in the European theater, had also been fed a steady diet of images designed to sharpen that hatred. Newsreels of concentration camps, photographs of executed civilians, stories of Nazi atrocities. By the time he crossed the Rhine in March of '45, Morrison's understanding of Germans had calcified into a simple binary. There were enemies to be defeated, and after defeat, there would be justice. Harsh justice, probably. Deserved justice, certainly. What he hadn't expected, what none of them had expected, was the children. The German military had collapsed with shocking speed in those final weeks. Towns that should have required days of house-to-house fighting surrendered after token resistance, or none at all. Wehrmacht soldiers, often boys and old men by then, threw down their weapons and raised their hands with expressions of pure relief. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12, and in its final months it had consumed itself with such totality that nothing remained but ruins and refugees and a silence that felt almost geological. Into this silence came the American occupiers, young men most of them, farm boys and factory workers, and college kids who'd been transformed by war into something harder. But not, it turned out, hard enough to ignore what they saw. Morrison remembered the first German town his unit had occupied intact, a small place called Budingen, northeast of Frankfurt. It was mid-April, and the apple trees were blooming with obscene beauty amid the destruction. The mayor, an old man who spoke some English, had met them with a white flag and a formal surrender. Morrison, still functioning on the heightened alertness of combat, had kept his rifle ready, scanning windows, expecting resistance. Instead, he'd seen faces at those windows, old women, children, more children than seemed possible, pale, thin, watching the Americans with expressions impossible to categorize. Not hate, though he'd expected that. Not fear exactly, though fear was certainly there. Mostly just exhaustion and something that looked almost like resignation. The war had rolled over these people like a boulder, and now they waited to see what came next. One of the younger guys in Morrison's squad, a kid from Wisconsin named Halverson, had been carrying a chocolate bar in his breast pocket, part of his ration that he'd been saving. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, had been standing in a doorway with her mother. The girl's eyes had fixed on Halverson's chocolate with such naked longing that Halverson had stopped, pulled out the bar, and held it out to her. The girl hadn't moved. The mother had pulled her back slightly, as if the chocolate might be poisoned or a trick. Halverson had put the chocolate on the doorstep and backed away, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. They'd walked another block before Morrison heard the girl crying. Not sad crying, happy crying. She'd tasted the chocolate. Jesus, Halverson had said quietly. Jesus Christ. It was a small moment, one chocolate bar, but it cracked something open. By December, the situation had evolved from military occupation into something more complex and more troubling. The Third Reich was gone, but its victims remained. Not just the obvious victims in the concentration camps, but millions of German civilians whose lives had been systematically destroyed by their own government's war. The distinction between soldier and civilian, between guilty and innocent, between enemy and simply human, had become blurred beyond recognition. The numbers were staggering. In the American occupation zone alone, approximately 16 million Germans struggled to survive that first winter. Housing was virtually non-existent. Allied bombing had destroyed roughly 25% of Germany's housing stock, and what remained was often taken over by occupation forces. Food production had collapsed. The rationing system, which had kept Germans fed through most of the war, had broken down completely with the Reich's defeat. The official Allied policy was clear. Germany was to be held responsible for the war it had started. There would be no repeat of the post-World War I situation, where Americans sent relief supplies while Germans claimed victimhood. This was to be a harsh peace. a just peace, a peace that taught lessons. But policy, it turned out, couldn't account for the reality on the ground. It couldn't account for what American soldiers saw every day. Children digging through garbage for scraps, elderly civilians collapsing from hunger in the street, families living in cellars without heat as winter deepened. The official German ration that winter, when it could be delivered at all, was approximately 1,000 calories per day. Starvation level. The food consisted primarily of turnips, potatoes when available, and bread, made from sawdust and whatever grain could be scraped together, for American soldiers who'd grown up during the Depression but never experienced genuine starvation, who came from a country where even rationing meant relative plenty. The contrast was visceral and disturbing. They ate hot meals from mess halls supplied by the most powerful logistical system in military history. They threw away more food in a day than most German families saw in a week, and they couldn't avoid seeing the German children, who gathered wherever American units were stationed, waiting with the terrible patience of the hungry for anything the Americans might discard. Captain Thomas Miller, commanding officer of a supply unit stationed in Wiesbaden, later recalled the moment that crystallized his thinking. It was early December, bitterly cold, and he'd been walking back to his quarters after dinner. A good meal, turkey and all the trimmings, when he'd encountered a German boy, perhaps 10 years old, carefully collecting cigarette butts from the ground outside the enlisted men's club. The boy had a tin can for the butts, and he worked with the concentration of someone performing a task of vital importance. Miller had stopped and watched for a moment. The boy, realizing he'd been noticed, had frozen, expecting to be chased away. Instead, Miller had asked, in his limited German, what the boy was doing. "For my father," the boy had answered. "He can trade tobacco for food." Miller had thought about his own son back in Ohio, 9 years old, probably at that moment sitting in a warm house, complaining about having to finish his dinner before he could have dessert. "Wait here," Miller had said. He'd gone back to the mess hall and filled a box with leftover food. Real food, American food, more than the boy's family had probably seen in months. When he'd returned and handed it to the boy, the child had simply stared at the box, then at Miller, then back at the box, as if unable to process what was happening. "Frohe Weihnachten," Miller had said, "Merry Christmas," though it was still 2 weeks until the holiday. The boy had run, clutching the box, disappearing into the ruins without a word. Miller had stood in the cold for a long time afterward, thinking about sons and fathers and enemies and the strange mathematics of mercy. The idea that became Operation Santa Claus didn't originate from headquarters. There was no memorandum from Schaff, no directive from Washington. It began, organically, spontaneously, in dozens of units across the American occupation zone, as individual soldiers and small groups decided independently that they would do something for German children at Christmas. In some units, it was the chaplains who took the lead. Father Michael O'Reilly, a Catholic priest serving with the 1st Infantry Division, organized a collection among his unit to gather toys and food for an orphanage in Aachen. In Frankfurt, Rabbi David Levinson, who'd lost family members in the camps and had every reason to hate Germans, nevertheless organized a Christmas party for 200 German children, telling anyone who questioned him, "The children didn't build Auschwitz." In other units, it was the enlisted men who drove the effort. Sergeant William Bradley, stationed near Munich, used his own money to buy supplies from the PX and organized a Christmas Eve party for the children in his unit's neighborhood. Private Joseph DeMarco, whose brother had been killed at the Bulge, nevertheless spent 3 weeks organizing a gift drive that ultimately provided presents for over 500 German children in Stuttgart. The pattern repeated across the occupation zone. American servicemen, acting without orders and often using their own resources, deciding to feed and give gifts to the children of the enemy. They raided their own rations, spent their pay at the PX, wrote letters home asking families to send toys and candy. They put together improvised Christmas parties in bombed-out buildings, decorated broken rooms with whatever they could find, dressed up as Santa Claus in costume cobbled together from red blankets and cotton batting. The scale grew rapidly. What started as individual acts of charity evolved into coordinated efforts involving entire companies and battalions. By mid-December, the movement had taken on a life of its own. Soldiers who'd been skeptical found themselves caught up in the momentum. Supply sergeants, who should have said no to requests for extra rations, found ways to say yes. Officers, who might have worried about fraternization regulations, looked the other way or actively participated. The name Operation Santa Claus appears to have emerged spontaneously in multiple locations. It wasn't an official designation. There was no operational plan, no mission briefing. But the name captured something essential about what was happening. This was Christmas. The first Christmas of peace after years of war, and these American soldiers, many of them barely more than children themselves, far from home and family, had decided to be Santa Claus for the children of the defeated enemy. Christmas Eve, 1945. In Morrison's hospital in Frankfurt, the courtyard had been transformed. While Morrison slept off his surgery, soldiers from the unit occupying the hospital complex had been working. They'd strung lights, real electric lights, impossibly bright after years of German blackouts. They'd set up tables and covered them with white sheets liberated from the hospital's linen supply. They'd hauled in boxes from supply trucks, food, real food, American food in quantities that would have seemed like fantasy to the children gathering outside. By mid-afternoon, more than 300 German children had assembled in the courtyard and the street beyond. Word had spread through Frankfurt's ruins with the speed of desperate hope. The Americans were giving out food, real food, and gifts at Christmas. Morrison, mobile now with crutches and against the protests of his German surgeon, had made his way to a window overlooking the courtyard. He could see soldiers setting out the food. Canned ham, white bread, real butter, oranges, which hadn't been seen in Germany for years, chocolate bars, cookies, condensed milk, canned vegetables. An embarrassment of riches by the standards of any German civilian. A miracle by the standards of starving children. And gifts, toys from packages that soldiers had received from home and donated. Dolls and toy soldiers and small games, candy canes, chewing gum, little things, worthless things by American standards, treasures beyond price to children who owned nothing. The girl Morrison had seen that morning, the one in the too small coat, was near the front of the line now. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed on the tables with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. She wasn't pushing or shoving. None of the children were. They waited with that terrible learned patience, as if afraid that any disturbance might make the impossible feast disappear. Corporal James Washington, a soldier from Morrison's unit, was working the serving line. Morrison watched as Washington filled a plate for each child. Meat, bread, vegetables, fruit. Real portions, not scraps. Washington had a gentle way with the children, smiling at each one, saying Merry Christmas in careful German, Frohe Weihnachten, even though most of the children were too overwhelmed to respond. The girl in the too small coat reached Washington. Morrison couldn't hear what was said, but he saw Washington lean down, say something to her, and carefully place an orange in her hands along with her plate of food. The girl looked at the orange as if it were made of gold. Her hands shook slightly as she held it. Then she did something Morrison would remember for the rest of his life. She lifted the orange to her face and simply smelled it. Her eyes closed. For perhaps 10 seconds, she stood there, just breathing in the scent of that orange, and an expression crossed her face that Morrison could only describe as transcendence. Pure, uncomplicated joy. When she opened her eyes, they were wet with tears. What Morrison witnessed that Christmas Eve was replicated with variations in hundreds of locations across the American occupation zone. The estimates vary. Record-keeping was not a priority, but by the most conservative calculations, American soldiers fed and gave gifts to at least 200,000 German children that first post-war Christmas. Some estimates range as high as 300,000. The logistics were staggering. Soldiers donated an estimated 50,000 pounds of their own rations. Units redirected supplies meant for troops. The Army's postal system, already strained, carried thousands of packages from America, sent at soldiers' requests, containing toys and candy for German children. In some cases, entire mess halls were essentially donated for the day, with German children fed the same Christmas dinner that would have gone to American troops. The food alone represented a transformation almost beyond comprehension for children accustomed to turnips and sawdust bread. A typical American soldier's ration that Christmas would have contained approximately 4,000 calories, 4 times the official German ration. When this food was given to children whose stomachs had shrunk from months of hunger, the results were sometimes physically traumatic. There are documented cases of children vomiting after eating chocolate or fatty foods. Their digestive systems, adapted to near starvation, simply couldn't process the sudden influx of calories and nutrients. Medical officers attached to some of the Christmas parties found themselves treating children for what amounted to refeeding syndrome, nausea, stomach pain, even temporary heart irregularities, as malnourished bodies struggled to adjust to sudden abundance. But even those children who became physically sick didn't stop eating. The food was too precious, too miraculous. They ate through discomfort, ate until they couldn't eat anymore, and then carefully wrapped what remained to take home to families. The psychological impact was perhaps even more profound than the physical one. These were children who'd been raised under Nazi indoctrination, taught that Americans were enemies, brutal, civilization-destroying enemies who wanted to exterminate the German people. Even after defeat, that propaganda had shaped expectations. When American soldiers occupied their towns, many children expected the worst: violence, theft, cruelty. Instead, they received chocolate and oranges and kindness. Greta Hoffmann, who was 8 years old that Christmas in Munich, later recalled, "I had been taught that Americans were monsters. My teachers told us they would kill us all. When the war ended, I was terrified. Then, on Christmas Eve, an American soldier gave me a chocolate bar and an orange. I didn't understand. Monsters don't give children presents." That was the moment I understood that everything I'd been taught was a lie. Not just about Americans, about everything. For many German children, that Christmas represented the first crack in the totalitarian worldview they'd inherited. The Americans, the supposed monsters, were treating them with a casual generosity that their own government had never shown. The food the Americans threw away would have fed German families for days. The gifts they handed out freely would have required months of saving under the Reich's system. The simple human kindness in a soldier's smile as he served food to a hungry child contradicted everything the propaganda had promised. It was, in its way, a more effective denazification program than anything the Allied military government would later impose. You cannot maintain hatred for people who feed your children at Christmas. In the Frankfurt hospital courtyard, the Christmas party continued into the evening. The children had been fed, many of them multiple servings, as much as they could hold. They'd received their gifts. Now, as darkness fell and the electric lights glowed against the winter sky, some of the soldiers began organizing games. It started simply. Corporal Washington, who had a harmonica, began playing Christmas carols. Some of the children knew the melodies. They were international after all, and began humming along, then singing tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Silent Night, ironically, which had originated in Austria but belonged to everyone now. O Tannenbaum. Even some American songs that the children didn't know but tried to follow. Sergeant Bradley organized a makeshift game of catch with a rubber ball from the PX. German children and American soldiers tossing a ball back and forth in a bombed-out hospital courtyard while Christmas carols played. The absurdity and beauty of it struck Morrison with almost physical force. The girl in the too-small coat, Morrison had learned her name was Anna, sat apart from the games. She'd finished her food carefully, methodically, and had wrapped the orange in a handkerchief that had probably been white years ago. She held it carefully, protectively. Morrison understood. That orange was going home to her family. It would be saved, rationed, made to last as long as possible. The memory of its taste would have to sustain her long after it was gone. Morrison hobbled out to the courtyard on his crutches. The cold bit through his uniform. But he needed to be out there. Needed to be part of this strange miracle happening in the ruins of Frankfurt. Anna watched him approach, her eyes cautious but not afraid. "Hello," Morrison said, exhausting most of his German vocabulary in one word. Anna didn't respond, but she didn't flee either. Morrison reached into his pocket and pulled out his own ration of chocolate, a Hershey's bar he'd been saving. He held it out to her. Anna looked at the chocolate, then at Morrison, then back at the chocolate. Her expression was complex, layered: desire, suspicion, confusion, hope. She'd already received more food today than probably any day in the past year. Why would this American soldier, this enemy soldier, give her more? "For your family," Morrison said, gesturing with the chocolate. "Family." Understanding dawned in Anna's eyes. Not just for her family. She reached out slowly and took the chocolate bar. Her fingers were thin, fragile-looking in the cold. She held the chocolate as carefully as she held the orange. "Danke," she whispered. "Thank you." Morrison nodded. There was nothing else to say. No common language for the complex emotions of that moment. He was an American soldier who'd been wounded fighting Germany. She was a German child whose city had been bombed by America. 6 months ago, they would have been on opposite sides of an absolute divide. Now on Christmas Eve in 1945, they were simply a man and a child, connected by an act of impulsive generosity that seemed simultaneously insignificant and world-changing. As Anna walked away, clutching her treasures, Morrison felt something shift inside him. The hatred that had sustained him through combat, the clear moral certainty that had made killing possible, had been complicated beyond recovery. The enemy had a face now, and it was the face of a little girl in a too-small coat, carefully carrying an orange home to her family. The official record of Operation Santa Claus is fragmentary and incomplete. The Army didn't track charitable activities that weren't part of official policy. No comprehensive orders were given, no after-action reports filed. What documentation exists comes primarily from unit histories, personal letters, newspaper accounts, and post-war interviews. But the scale is undeniable. Across the American occupation zone, in dozens of cities and hundreds of towns, Christmas 1945 saw an unprecedented outpouring of mercy from soldiers to the children of the enemy. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 200,000 German children received food and gifts from American soldiers that day. More generous estimates range up to 300,000. The food distributed represented millions of calories. Tens of thousands of pounds of meat, bread, vegetables, fruit, candy, and other supplies. The gifts, while individually small, totaled in the tens of thousands. Toys, clothes, school supplies, simple pleasures that had been absent from German children's lives for years. But the true scale of Operation Santa Claus can't be measured in pounds of food or numbers of presents. It can only be measured in transformed relationships, in shifted perspectives, in the slow, difficult work of rebuilding human connections across the chasm of war. For the American soldiers who participated, the experience was equally transformative. Many of them had entered Germany as conquerors, hardened by combat, carrying justified anger about Nazi atrocities. They'd expected to feel satisfaction at Germany's defeat, perhaps even pleasure at German suffering. Instead, they'd encountered human beings, hungry, frightened, defeated human beings who were no longer enemies, but simply victims of a catastrophe that had consumed everyone. The moral clarity of war had given way to the moral ambiguity of peace, and that ambiguity demanded a more sophisticated response than simple revenge. Sergeant Bradley later wrote to his wife, "We beat them fair and square, and they deserve to have lost. But their kids don't deserve to starve. No kid deserves that. I keep thinking about our Tommy, and I can't stand the idea that somewhere some kid his age is going hungry. So we're doing what we can. It's not much, but it's something." That sentiment, "it's not much, but it's something," echoed across the occupation zone. Individual soldiers, acting without orders, deciding that even if they couldn't solve Germany's crisis, they could at least feed some children at Christmas. It was a modest goal, a limited intervention, but its effects rippled far beyond that single day. Operation Santa Claus continued beyond that first Christmas, through the winter of 1945 to 46 and into the spring. American units maintained their charitable efforts. The organized Christmas parties gave way to more sustained programs, regular food distributions, support for orphanages, adoption of particular German schools or children's homes by American units. Some of these efforts became quasi-official. The military government, initially cautious about fraternization, gradually accepted that American soldiers were going to help German civilians regardless of policy. Regulations were quietly relaxed. Supply officers who'd been told to restrict distributions to military needs found ways to redirect surplus to civilian use. The longer-term impact of these efforts is difficult to quantify, but impossible to dismiss. At the most practical level, the food and supplies provided by American soldiers saved lives. How many lives? There's no way to know with certainty, but in a winter when malnutrition and starvation were rampant, when children's mortality rates spiked dramatically, every meal mattered. At a psychological and political level, the impact was profound. Operation Santa Claus and similar efforts helped lay the groundwork for a fundamental shift in German-American relations. The children who received chocolate and oranges from American soldiers in 1945 grew up to be the adults who built the Federal Republic of Germany, the democratic, Western-aligned Germany that became America's ally in the Cold War. That transformation wasn't inevitable. Germany could have followed a different path after defeat. Resentment, victimhood, desires for revenge. All were possible, even probable, given the scale of Germany's destruction. That Germany instead chose democracy, chose reconciliation, chose partnership with its former enemies had many causes, but among them was the simple fact that ordinary Germans had experienced American generosity at their moment of greatest vulnerability. Greta Hoffmann, the girl who received chocolate and an orange in Munich in 1945, later became a teacher in the Federal Republic. She made a point of teaching her students about the American soldiers who fed German children after the war. They didn't have to do that, she would tell her classes. We had been enemies. We had caused terrible suffering. They could have let us starve, and many people would have said we deserved it. But they chose mercy instead. That choice changed everything. By late January 1946, Morrison had recovered enough to be transferred to a hospital in England, preparatory to being shipped home to the United States. His leg would never be quite right. He'd walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But he'd keep the leg, and he'd survived, which was more than many of his comrades could say. Before he left Frankfurt, he made a point of finding the German surgeon who'd operated on him. Dr. Friedrich Becker, he'd learned the man's name was. A respected orthopedic surgeon before the war, a Wehrmacht medical officer during it, now working for the American occupation authorities, because there was nowhere else to work. "I wanted to thank you," Morrison said, feeling the inadequacy of the words even as he spoke them. Becker shook his head. "I am a doctor. I treated a patient. This is what doctors do. You could have let me wait. You could have, I don't know, Done less. Why would I do this? Becker seemed genuinely puzzled. You are a human being who needed help. I had the skill to help. The war is over. We must decide what kind of people we will be now that the killing has stopped. They stood in silence for a moment, two men on opposite sides of a war that had killed millions, connected now by the simple fact of a successful surgery. What you did for the children, Becker said quietly. On Christmas, my daughter was there. She is 10 years old. She received food and an orange from your soldiers. She has not stopped talking about it. She keeps the orange peel in a box next to her bed. She says it smells like hope. Morrison felt his throat tighten. I'm glad, he managed. You should know, Becker continued, what it meant. Not just the food, though the food was... We are very hungry, Mr. Morrison. But more than the food, what it meant that you chose to be kind. After everything, after all that we Germans have done, you chose kindness. This is not something we will forget. Morrison flew to England 2 days later. He spent the flight thinking about Anna, the girl in the too small coat, and about Becker's daughter with her cherished orange peel, and about the strange alchemy that transforms enemies into something else. Not friends, exactly. That would come later, if at all. But human beings, recognizing each other's humanity across the ruins of war. 75 years later, historians still debate the significance of Operation Santa Claus. Some dismiss it as a minor footnote, a feel-good story that changed nothing fundamental about post-war occupation policy or German-American relations. Others argue that it represented a crucial moment of moral choice when individual Americans decided that mercy mattered more than revenge, that children's hunger was more important than abstract justice. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Operation Santa Claus didn't single-handedly create the post-war order. It didn't end German suffering. That would require years and the massive infusion of Marshall Plan aid. It didn't automatically reconcile former enemies or erase the crimes of the Nazi regime. What it did was create moments of human connection in circumstances designed to prevent such connections. It gave German children their first experience of American generosity at precisely the moment when they were most vulnerable and most receptive. It allowed American soldiers to discover that mercy and strength could coexist, that defeating an enemy didn't require hating its children. These were small things, personal things, individual things. They happened in the margins of official policy, often in defiance of regulations about fraternization and resource allocation. They were improvised, spontaneous, uncoordinated. They were, in many ways, accidental. But they mattered. History is made not just by grand strategies and official policies, but by individual choices in specific moments. The choice made by thousands of American soldiers in December of 1945. The choice to feed hungry children rather than hoard resources, to extend mercy rather than withhold it, to see in German children a reflection of their own sons and daughters rather than the offspring of enemies, was one of those choices that echoes beyond its moment. Robert Morrison returned to Pennsylvania in March of 1946. He married his high school sweetheart, had 3 children, worked in a furniture factory for 40 years. He rarely talked about the war, but he kept 2 photographs in his desk drawer. One of his unit in basic training, all of them young and grinning and unaware of what was coming, and one of the Frankfurt hospital courtyard on Christmas Eve, 1945. You can see the lights strung overhead, the tables laden with food, the German children lined up with expressions of disbelief and hope, and in the foreground, slightly out of focus, a girl in a too small coat, holding an orange like it was made of dreams. He never learned what happened to that girl. Never knew if she survived the harsh winter that followed. Never knew if the orange made it home to her family. Never knew if she grew up to be someone who told her own children about the American soldiers who fed German kids at Christmas when they didn't have to, when every reason said they shouldn't, but they did anyway. But he kept the photograph, and sometimes Late at night, when memory and regret and the strange mathematics of mercy kept him awake, he would look at it and remember the moment when history pivoted on an act of impulsive kindness, and wonder what kind of world might exist if more people chose to feed hungry children rather than nurse justified grievances. Operation Santa Claus was never officially recognized. There were no medals for feeding German children, no commendations for unauthorized redistribution of military supplies, no honors for soldiers who chose mercy over regulations. The soldiers who participated did so without expectation of recognition, motivated only by their own consciences and the unbearable sight of hungry children. But the legacy persisted. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt and transformed from enemy to ally, as the Federal Republic became one of America's strongest partners, as German and American soldiers served side by side in NATO, the memory of that first Christmas remained. Not in official histories or government documents, but in family stories, in personal testimonies, in the lived experience of people who remembered when everything seemed lost and then, unexpectedly, miraculously, experienced kindness. Anna, the girl in the too small coat, survived the winter of 45 to 46. She grew up in the Federal Republic, married, had children of her own. She never forgot the Christmas when American soldiers fed 300 children in a hospital courtyard in Frankfurt, when an orange seemed like a miracle, when the enemy revealed himself to be simply human. Years later, when her grandchildren would ask her about the war, she would tell them many things about suffering and loss and the cost of hatred, but she would always end with the story of that Christmas, of the American soldier who gave her family chocolate when he didn't have to, of the moment when she understood that the world contained more mercy than she had been taught to expect. "Remember this," she would tell them. "In the darkest times, some people choose kindness. Never forget that you have that choice too." That was the true legacy of Operation Santa Claus. Not the food distributed or the supplies donated, but the lesson taught and learned on both sides, that enemies can become human again. That mercy is possible even in the aftermath of terrible crimes. That sometimes the most important victories are won not through force but through the simple act of feeding a hungry child. The chocolate bars and oranges distributed on Christmas of 1945 were consumed long ago. But the memory of that choice, the choice to be kind when kindness wasn't required, to be generous when generosity wasn't expected, to see in the children of enemies the same humanity as in one's own children, that memory endures. It endures in the special relationship between Germany and America that grew from the ruins of war. It endures in the example it provides for how former enemies might find their way to reconciliation. It endures in the simple truth that when everything seems lost, an act of mercy can light a candle against the darkness, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes one chocolate bar at a time, one orange at a time, one choice at a time, the world becomes a slightly better place. Not perfect, not redeemed, but better, worth the effort, worth the sacrifice, worth choosing mercy over revenge, even when revenge seems justified. That was the gift American soldiers gave German children at Christmas of 1945. Not just food and toys, but hope. The possibility that the future might be different from the past. The promise that humanity survives even the worst that humans can do to each other. In the end, that may be the most important gift anyone can give.